Okay. So here we have again, we're talking about middle. Sometimes it's called late childhood, depending on the book you're reading, really. But what we're really talking about is pretty much children from about the age of 6 through the nearing the end of the puberty ages when we go into adolescence. Okay. Um, and what this period really is about, we think, is about preparing the body really for puberty to really occur. Okay. So this is where we find that girls start to grow faster at first, but by about the age of 8 or 9, boys will kind of catch up. And this is where often children will complain about the thing called growing pains, because the bones are stretching and getting taller and building. That can stretch and bind the muscles, especially with children who tend to be very inactive, because those muscles may not be worked as much. They can experience a little bit more growing pain as those muscles are stretched and worked as the body grows. Okay. During this period, up to this period, if you'll notice, most children have littler legs. If you look at a toddler, even a child into the age of 5 or 6, they tend to have a longer torso than legs. And this is what starts to really start to grow rapidly during these years. Um, and that is usually the main source of these growing pains that we see. Okay. And we also note that during this period is when a lot of our fine motor skills really start to develop. So we're able to write and draw better. Becomes easier to color within lines and to, uh, uh, well, write better. I'm looking at my own writing right now and wondering if I was better when I was 4 or 5 than now, but we supposedly become better at writing. Um, and we're able to do more fine-tuned things. And this is kind of why a lot of the psychologists since Freud kind of thought that this was a period of skill development, really. That because we're getting better and better at fine motor and gross motor movements, this is about refining those systems and getting them to work efficiently as we move into then the adult, adolescence, and young adult years. Okay. So physical growth, um, the peak of growth, physical growth tends to be for girls about 10 and a half years of age tends to be the average, where most girls will reach their maximum, for example, tallness or shortness or body size. And it's about 14 and a half for boys. Okay. And as we will see, this then, when we get to social emotional development, brings up some of the tensions that can occur between girls and boys, because girls, because they develop at an earlier age, leaves them susceptible to a lot of the immature harassment, as you would say, or immature statements that could come from um, boys, um, especially for young girls at this age when they fully develop, because their puberty has started at a younger age and have become more developed in the chest and hip areas. Okay. Um, as we mentioned at the beginning of the course, one of the current theories of why teenagers often do impulsive behaviors is it is during the end of the late childhood period where we see this rapid myelination of the brain. Okay. And remember, the purpose of the myelination is to make it so that as we transition into adulthood, we can make them those rapid, instant survival behaviors. So, we see a kid with a car coming towards them, we act instantly, whereas the kid usually will freeze because their brain isn't processing the information fast enough. They're not sure where to go. Okay. Um, some areas of the brain that will continue to grow through these years and even past them is the frontal lobe. So this is the area of the brain that deals with logic and being able to solve those math problems. But the frontal lobe also deals a lot with our social world. Okay. And this is why, even in a cross-cultural perspective, we think when we get to adolescence, we'll talk a lot about identity development. And identity for adolescents is largely predicted by the peer group they're in. Okay. Well, when we see these kind of development things, we're also seeing the frontal lobe of the brain developing. Okay. The parietal lobe is also starting to develop this well during this period. And kind of the example of the parietal lobe is that if you've ever seen a little kiddo try to throw a ball versus an 8 to 9 year old throw a ball, there's a difference. They're more on target. They're more the throw is a lot cleaner, and a lot of times we attribute it to the muscle development between that age group and the later childhood. But it also has to do with the development of the parietal lobe that deals with who we are in time and space, where we exist. Okay. Um, and so we're able to then know, if I want to throw a ball across the room, about approximately what I'll need to do. Okay. The corpus callosum is also developing during this period a lot. And this is what gets us into the fine motor movement and our refinements use of language. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Okay. And it helps us so that we can coordinate better in movement and in language and hearing and even in vision, because that area that connects the two lobes is starting to develop and become more connected. Okay. And then we have connections related to long-term memory. During this period, the brain also within the hippocampus and hypothalamus, those areas that deal with long-term memory, start to develop, and we get a sudden increase in the number of connections. Okay. This is why a lot of times when we think about our autobiographical history, we start to usually start in this late childhood era. Usually around fifth and sixth grade is where our memories start to become most clear. And it has a lot to do with this area of the brain that is now becoming well developed. Okay. And then during this age period, and there's some up uh, updates that probably should be done on these, is some very common disorders that tend to be seen as physically caused mostly um, during this term is dyslexia and ADHD are two of the most common disorders that are diagnosed during this period of age. Dyslexia is a problem with word recognition and decoding and spelling. Okay. It is where an individual, well, an example is that I have some forms of dyslexia. Okay. So when you tell me, for example, your phone number or something like that, especially dealing with numbers, you should write it down because the likelihood that I will write down the correct number, even with you telling me it, is very, very low. Um, and so that's kind of a form of dyslexia. Other forms is seeing words and paragraphs in reverse, the inability to make sense of words because they look jumbled up individually. And what this tends to be associated with, and I need to make this clear, these are associations, is associated with higher levels of things called glutamate and choline and more right hemisphere activity. Okay. But probably the areas that are most connected to this is there's less connection to what's called the Broca's area and the Wernicke area. Okay. What happens if your Broca area is removed is that you can speak perfectly fine. You can make very coherent sentences and everything else. But when someone says something to you, you don't understand them at all. It sounds like they could, if you don't know German, it sounds like they're talking German to you. And that's what happens when we get lesions or dysfunctions in the Broca area. We have a reception problem, but we don't have an outward communication problem. With damage in the Wernicke's area, we can understand things perfectly fine, but our responded response comes out more nonsense. So let's say somebody says, um, do you have a cat? They may respond with, I don't think Walmart is a place to get milk. Okay. They're trying to produce the response that you're asking for. And if you ask them to write down the response is just fine written, but the production, the vocal production comes out wrong. Okay. And these are some of the similar things we see with dyslexia, except instead of dealing with auditory and vocal issues, we're dealing with visual and handwritten issues, such as either numbers or words and the like. Okay. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You may have heard this called ADD or AHD, but in the DSM-5, the last revision, they've kind of combined it. So there is no such thing, according to a modern psychiatrist, of just having attention deficit disorder and attention hyperactivity disorder. It is one disorder because they find that individuals who used to have the two separate ones kind of have a combination still. So it's now just ADHD, which deals with inattention, hyperactivity, very impulsive. It's the kiddo that can't sit still in the class. And this is one, though, that is of debate of whether it's a true physical disorder or something that is a really a combination of environment and biology. Okay, are we just predisposed to potentially have ADHD? Okay, and there are some correlates with ADHD, is that brain and hyperactivities, and this is not a definitive, on average are 5% smaller, but that also means that 50% it's the same size and 50% it's smaller. So it's not a consistent finding. Okay. Possible cause by maternal use of alcohol or tobacco. Um, but again, this issue is that we know children with moms who didn't drink alcohol and tobacco who have ADHD. So while these are correlated to each other, they're not perfect. So these two physical explanations are really unsatisfying for most individuals. Okay. The other thing that complicates um, the debate around ADHD and whether it's something physical or psychological or a combination is when we look at diagnosis rates, when is someone diagnosed, and cross-cultural comparisons. Okay. So some examples of this is that most children who are diagnosed with ADHD are born in the month of August or September. Okay. And so it might lead some people to believe, there was once what's called the uh, cold theory of ADHD, because if you think about August, September, that means mom and dad got busy during the cold months of December and January, right? And so there was this theory that it was cold weather. Um, but then people took a closer look at it, and the people who diagnose ADHD or report it the most tend to be kindergarten and first grade teachers. Okay. And when we looked at who's being diagnosed in a classroom by teachers, it tends to be those students who were held back because of the cutoff for entering into kindergarten or first grade, which usually occurs in August or September, depending upon the school district. So, what you have in that classroom setting is you have children, a set of children that are 1 year less mature than the rest of the children in the classroom. Okay. And what do teachers use as a comparison to determine whether a child is hyperactive or inattentive? They use the classroom, right? They use the other students who have a year more maturity than those children who were born in August and September. Okay. So that suggests there might be something going on with the way we're diagnosing and determining it. The other issue that comes up is when we look at this cross culturally. And if you've taken my Psych 101 or that class, you know this story between the United States and, for example, France. France, by all means, because of the way their culture is and everything else, really shouldn't have different diagnosis rates for this disorder than the United States. But indeed, they do. For example, here in the United States, the diagnosis rate is somewhere between 11 to 13%. In France, it's below 2%. Okay. And the question is why? Why is it different between France and the United States? And it really comes to how the difference between how the French investigate and diagnose ADHD than the way we do here in the United States. We use the pure medical model, where if a child is having behavioral issues, it is a disorder of the child. There's something wrong with that child. Okay. In France, before diagnosing a child, they take what's called a systems approach. Okay. So before diagnosing a child in France, they'll go in and they'll do training with the parents. They'll go in and do training with the teachers, and they will make sure that the environment is consistent and all of these kinds of things. And they found that by working with the child's systems, they only have to diagnose children at about a 2% rate versus 13% rate. Okay. So the debate is really raging. I will say, I know some individuals with ADHD as adults, and when they're put on medication and everything else, they report having a brand new brain that all of a sudden can focus and they can clearly work through what they're doing. But medicating children, it tends to be a mixed bag. There's some children that do very well on it, and then there's other children where it just basically makes them either zombies or it really doesn't do much of anything. Okay. So we have a lot of work to do in this area, especially with the properly diagnosing the disorder, because there's definitely individuals that can benefit from treatment, um, and children who may be better off with some other type of intervention. Okay. What about intellectual disorders? We talked a little bit about this in early childhood. We talked about language delay, those types of things. We talked a little bit about dyslexia, which isn't an intellectual disorder. But what about children who score below what you call the standard deviation for intelligence, which is 85%? And this one I'm going to put a pause on because we'll talk about it when we get to cognition. So we'll talk about this one a little bit later. Um, but it's not an area that we should. I'm bringing it up now because there's intellectual disorders such as Down syndromes and other disorders that do have a biological drive. And then there's other intellectual disorders that seem to be environmental. And so there seems to be some physical components for some, but not for others. But again, the thing that complicates all of this is even individuals with Down syndrome can have a perfectly functioning and even high intellectual ability despite the disorder that they have. So we'll need to talk about those a little bit later when we get into cognition. Okay. Some of the growing areas of concern when it comes to physical issues with children during this age group is we have seen a direct increase in the number of calories children during this age group ingest and a decrease in the physical activity that they do. And so we find that in this age group, this is probably what is contributing to what's called the obesity crisis, especially here in the United States. Um, but again, it becomes complicated when you look at this cross-culturally because there's other first world nations that don't demand the physical parts of childhood that you used to, that don't have an obesity crisis. Okay. But what seems to be occurring here in the United States has to do with our diet that we have, which tends to be inadequate in nutritions, but very high in calorie. Um, because we have found that we have deficiencies in A, C, and E, magnesium, phosphorus, um, in those types of foods. We're finding that high processed foods don't digest as good. So it says here is fast food the main culprit. And the question then becomes is it the processed food or is it not eating enough of natural foods? And I'm going to be honest, it's still of debate. Um, um, and, uh, and this is an issue that if you're a parent or you're thinking of having a child, um, that you're going to want to heavily consider. Um, because it is with each excessive generation, it seems that this problem is getting a little bit worse and worse. And so, how we approach that needs to be kind of more community based and a conversation within our communities about health and safety of our children and the nutrition that we provide for them. So, and I should say that a lot of the diet and exercise, these are some very things that are associated with those that we're seeing more and more common. The first one is type 2 diabetes. We know this is a high issue among Native American communities, and it has an increased effect because of these more modern ways of eating that we see, the high processed foods, the nutrition, the lack of nutrition within a lot of foods. And so we're seeing that in association with uh, the modern diet, we're seeing these issues elevated among populations that are already sensitive to it. So, for example, we're seeing these really take off in Native American communities, Black American communities, and now in more Latin American communities, we're starting to see this really become an issue for children. Okay. Asthma, more emergency room trips, use of medications. We're seeing again, probably due to our diets, elevated blood pressure, cholesterol, likelihood of cancers are on the increase. Um, and so, again, when we talk about this, and I think this slide is a little bit old because when it says, how do we control obesity? It says limit TV time. I think this one needs to be updated because I think we use the term screen time now, but increasing activity of children, but also increasing their nutrition within their diet seems to be some of the solutions to kind of identify. All right. So now what about sleep? So we saw in infancy, it was about 16 hours a day. We got into early childhood and it was around 11 to 12 hours a day. Now we're seeing children in this middle childhood era needing around 9 to 10 hours of sleep. Okay. We find that lack of sleep tends to increase with age, though, and mainly because if you think about the way um, children are kind of socialized in early childhood, the parent very much is in control of the parent time, the when, the where, all of those kinds of things. And then as a child develops, we let those strings loosen and provide more independence. Okay. And then with that independence, of course, comes testing the limits. But we should note that there are some associations that seem to be due to a lack of appropriate amount of sleep for children, especially in the later childhood era when their body is going through puberty. It has more demanding nutritional needs than it traditionally did. You're seeing growth of the muscles in the legs, those kinds of things. Is that we find that there's a lot of somatic complaints. Somatic complaints are those pains that can't be explained by any immediate injury. Poor school performance, mood disorders, motor skill problems, and behaviors problems. Okay. And these are all very common um, indicators that a child is not getting enough sleep. Okay. There's also something that is common among children into late childhood, and that's what's called nocturnal unaresis, often called bedwetting. And we find that a lot of nocturnal unaresis has to do with the child's quality of sleep. Okay. Is that because they're not getting enough sleep, when they are sleeping, they're in a deep, deep sleep mode. but their muscles haven't quite shut down on the body, so they can lose control over their bowel movements. Okay. Now, that's not the only reason for nocturnal urineresis. There's other things, there's behavioral things and whatnot, but the main culprit tends to be lack of sleep. So if you have a child or know of a child who's 8 to 9, 10 years old dealing with this issue, first of all, don't shame them for it. That's going to create a worse problem. But look at their sleep schedule. Are they getting decent amount of sleep? And it may be worth even doing a sleep study, because that usually tends to be the reason. If it's not, then you'll need to do some behavioral investigation, such as being a bully or being bullied or social problems or things like that. Okay. The interesting thing, and again, I mentioned that a lot of our studies on this age group comes from school. And so we should talk about physical education and physical activity, because what we find is, uh, can't think all of a sudden. What we find is actually the more physical active a child can be, the better they are in school and in cognition and even behaviorally. Okay. So for example, in some schools that they'll do like an hour lesson, and then they'll do 30 minutes of playtime or exercise, and then an hour and then more playtime. We find that those children actually perform better than children who have to sit in a classroom from 8 to, let's say, 10, and then you get a little 15-minute recess, and then you're back at 11:15 to whenever. That the more breaks and the more physical activity, the better the child actually, uh, both behaves but also performs in the classroom. So the goal, though, behind the physical education movement, or famously called PE, which I did not like, the goal is to develop an interest in activities children will pursue throughout their life. And that's really the idea or the intentions behind when physical education was developed. So far, though, only about 5 states require it here in the United States. And children's attitudes towards PE become more negative over time because of the built-in competition we have here, especially in the United States. Some of us can remember the dodgeball days and all those kinds of things, where the goal was to eliminate another individual or beat another individual. In those kinds of senses, this is what then creates that more negative attitude. Okay. The whole idea behind physical education really was based upon a theory called leisure repertoire theory. And the goal was is to give lessons about the importance of leisure that would last a lifetime, meaning that it's important to have things like hobbies. It's important to go, sit out in the yard and just exist in a leisurely way. That it's really unhealthy to constantly be doing and doing and doing. In the school setting, it's listening to a teacher, taking notes, doing assignments. Well, the idea behind PE was originally to teach children to take a break, do something physical so that they can kind of recalibrate and go back and be active in their educational process. Okay. And what we have found, at least in other countries, that indeed this idea of including leisure into the curriculum does create a highly effective and productive uh, child and well into adulthood. But I think we got to put a physical educator into the classroom instead of the football coach. Take away a little bit of that competition and that the things that kind of um, can happen in our American system. So again, this kind of goes back to the ideas of things, for example, like a recess, the crucialness and necessary component accounts for about 40 per, the interesting thing is recess in school today, and I think this is significant, accounts for about 40% of a child's daily activity. So if you think about the length of a recess, right, they're anywhere from like 15 maybe to 30 minutes. That accounts for about 40% of the total activity a child will do during a whole entire day. And schools can provide children with inexpensive equipment, promote activities, and promote classroom attentive and social skills and self-control. I've mentioned in this class before that in early childhood, one of the things that is really important is play. And now what we're seeing in late childhood is play put into action. I need to drink something. Excuse me. Um, is play put into action? Oh, that sounds a little better. And this is where children are now using their peer groups. They may use some type of imaginative play. They may come up with some activity, but what they're doing is really testing um, um, that what they had learned in early childhood about interaction with each other. Okay. And some other interesting things is that parents can encourage physical activity through role modeling, of course, but kind of interesting, the idea of rough and tumble play, especially among boys, where from adults it can look like fighting, but the goal is to kind of have fun. And it's kind of interesting. What we find is that children, especially boys, and we're finding more and more with girls, that the more a child engages in this rough and tumble play, it actually promotes physical and neural growth. Physical growth as far as how the body is developing and growing, and actually neural density, the number of connections the brain makes. And what we find is that it also teaches in children their physical social limitations. So it teaches a child when they physically have gone too far. Um, and that when play turns into hurt, or what are those limits that we negotiate with each other? Okay. We also find that children who get out into what's the known as the great outdoors, okay, is that we find that the more time children spend outside, again, there are what we call benefit boosts. Being outside and being active outside tends to increase immunity. It tends to decrease things like anxiety and depressive symptoms for children. It tends to also be associated with better academic performance and what are known as analogy problem solving. Okay. An analogy is where you're told a story and then you have to use some type of logic to solve that problem. to come to the appropriate conclusion of what the person should do. And we find that children who tend to be more, tend to spend more time in the great outdoors and outside, tend to be better at analogy problems than they do, for example, uh, um, doing a math problem using linear methodologies. Okay. Um, and so there's benefits again, getting back to this idea. We think what happens is the outdoors are relevant. They make things more exciting and fun. They ensure that all young people have access, places that are safe, clean, and closed. Empower and enable youth to work and volunteer outdoors are all great ways to encourage these things and build on the base of environmental and outdoor education, both formally and informally. Okay. The point being is again, when we look at children's experiences, children that tend to be indoors, isolated, those types of things tend to be less competent, less be able to solve social problems that come up, tend to have higher rates of depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms versus children who are encouraged to explore their entire world. Um, and so, some benefits of being in the outdoors. Okay. And we find these other associations with physical aspects. We find that more activity outside and stuff, it tends to what's called mediate the relationship between calorie intake and weight gain. Greater ability to focus on attention. We find children have more self-discipline, lower levels of distress, higher levels of self-worth, and positive and protective attitudes towards the natural world, which I think by the view of our world right now, we could use more of. Okay. All right. So that kind of ends my voice today. That kind of ends the physical aspects of this age group. And I hope that you saw that one, it's important to be actively and engaged, maintain good, healthy schedules and boundaries, and encourage interaction are kind of, I think, the main takeaways for the physical development part. But I am going